right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Today we have Monica Smith, who is a senior care advocate and the owner of Senior Care Authority in Los Angeles, here to present Adults with Aging Parent Drivers. I will let her take it away from here.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay, Daphne?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for everyone for attending. We're going to talk a little bit today about adults with aging parent drivers, which I'm assuming are most of the people here on the call. I am in that cohort as well. I have my own parents who one is still driving. So we understand the challenges that come along with that. As Daphne said, my name is Monica Smith. I own Senior Care Authority in Northwest Los Angeles, and we're an organization located all across the country. I started my journey in senior care. I started my career as a nurse. I was an RN and worked in home health and neurology, and then did some other things, and then entered the senior care industry when I was struggling to figure out how to care for my own parents. And so that brought me to where I'm at the moment. So just a quick overview, Senior Care Authority, what we do, we are a high touch concierge assistance to families. So for families who are struggling to care for their loved ones at home, we help find assisted living communities, memory care facilities, but we're also a great resource to point people in the right direction. We collaborate with organizations like LISA and helping caregivers trying to truly understand all of the resources that are available to them in caring for their loved ones, whether it be how to stay at home and age in place, or again, if staying at home is no longer a viable solution, then we can help figure out what the best solution is for you and your loved ones. So we have what's called placement services. It's what I was describing. If you have loved ones who can no longer stay at home, we help find the appropriate environment for them. That is typically at no cost to the families because we find the best options, and then we're paid a referral fee from those different facilities. We have consulting services as well. So if you need some assistance in trying to figure out how to keep your loved one at home, or you need different resources or need help understanding the resources, then we have some consulting that's available for that. And then thirdly, which is what I'm here primarily to talk about today, is what we call our Beyond Driving with Dignity program. And basically, it's a self-assessment workshop for older drivers to help them determine on their own whether or not they should still be driving. And so everybody I talk about, everybody that I mention that to, they say, oh, I know somebody who needs that. So we have a lot of people who could really benefit from that service. But in lieu of the service, I wanted to talk about today just different tactics, what the situation is related to senior drivers, why there are challenges with some people as they age, some of the challenges that they experience, and then as adult children of those seniors, how can we help ensure that our loved ones stay safe if they want to continue driving. Typically, when I talk and when I present, I would like things to be very interactive. A virtual environment doesn't always lend itself to that. So Daphne, I know, is watching questions along the way. So Daphne, feel free to interrupt and ask questions along the way, because I would like for it to be as interactive as possible. I hate just talking for an hour. So feel free to pipe up with questions along the way if you have some. So I want to start with driving and why driving is so important to people. And I always say this, I mean, if we can all think back to when we first got our driver's license, what that meant to us, or who remembers their first car. You know, a lot of people really have a visceral response and a visceral reaction to that question. This was my first car that I actually bought on my own. It was a Jeep Eagle Talon, and I had just graduated from nursing school. And I went and I bought my own car, and I felt like so proud. And you know, when I got my license, it's just liberating. So if you think of the emotional attachment that comes along with driving, it's really the first time in our lives that we have some true freedom. Which is, I have a 17-year-old son who just started driving. It's terrifying for the parents, but it's freedom once you get your license and have access to a car. So some of the things we just said, you know, it's a symbol of independence and freedom. It's a way to stay socially connected, for us at least. It's a source of self-esteem. You've accomplished something, right? You have a driver's license. You can get yourself around. You can now go to the store. You can go, you know, to your hobbies and family events on your own. So it's a very personal thing, driving. And sometimes what happens is that, you know, letting go of the keys can really feel like losing part of oneself. So one thing that you're going to hear about in this discussion today is the need for empathy and how important it is for us to be empathetic to our aging loved ones, because this is a really big deal to stop driving. And sometimes it's hard for us as the adult children to have that empathy when you see that it's sometimes maybe so unsafe, not necessarily just for the driver, but for anybody else who's out on the roads and anybody else who's driving. So how important is the issue today in society? So these are just some stats. By 2030, there'll be 70 million people aged 65 and older, and 85 to 90% of them are licensed to drive. So secondly, seniors have the highest crash death rate per mile driven. So a lot of times as people age, they drive less, but they're having more accidents. Their death rate is much higher per mile driven if you compare it to the rest of the population. I think this is a really interesting bullet point. Seniors are outliving their ability to drive safely by an average of 7 to 10 years. We have awesome technology and medical technology, and people are living longer and longer, and they're literally outliving their ability to drive. So it's important to now plan for a driving retirement, and that's how we preface it. That's what we say when talking with clients. You may want to consider retiring from driving because you know, you've lived longer than your driving lifespan. So our goal and our what we want to try to help you do is help your parents plan for that. Daphne, any questions or anything about any of that along the way so far?
Yes, I just got a question. It is from an anonymous attendee. Can you speak to what happens with insurance once someone is diagnosed with dementia?
Yeah, we'll get to that in just a little bit. So I've got several different things that we're covering, and it's all different depending on the insurance companies themselves. But I think one thing to keep in mind is the DMV and how dementia affects license and getting a license and in the different states. And so I'm assuming there are people from all over the country on this. I live in California, and each state is a little bit different, but I will get to that in a little bit. Anything else?
Nope,
right.
that was the only question that we have at the
Perfect.
moment.
All right. So we talked about the statistics related to society, but how important is this issue to our seniors? You know, we talked originally about, you know, the visceral feeling, the emotional impact or the emotional response people have to driving. And this is a quote from a Dr. Betts, Department of Emergency Medicine, University of Colorado. Driving is key for mobility and independence, and driving cessation has been linked to depression and even early death. So again, I'm going to talk over and over again about how important it is for us to be empathetic with our loved ones as we're having some of these discussions along the way. One of the problems is that as people age, they tend to become more frail. And so even if it's not their fault, in accidents, they have a higher probability of dying than our younger counterparts. So, a two-car fatal collision where one driver is 70 or older, the older driver is 3.5 times more likely to be killed just because of other conditions they may have. Maybe there's some heart conditions, maybe there's just general frailty along the way. So, a lot of times when we're talking to some of our seniors who are right on the borderline, it's not necessarily about their skills and their ability. It's what happens when bad things happen. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So sometimes with older drivers, as they start having diminished skills, I say this is the elephant in the room. Everyone wants someone or anyone else to say something, and no one really wants to own that responsibility and have that responsibility for a multitude of reasons. And so why people might be reluctant, and I'm sure you can all understand and relate to this. It's an unnerving and an uncomfortable conversation, and you want to avoid conflict and hurt feelings. Sometimes you're having these conversations with your parents who raised you, and sometimes it gets to a point where roles feel like they're a little bit reversed. And so, as I mentioned earlier, someone giving up their keys is a really big deal. There's a loss of self, a loss of independence, and so people want to avoid that. The conversation may make the situation worse. Um, when I started having some conversations with my mother, I adore her and I love her. My mother is incredibly independent and incredibly opinionated and ready to prove anyone wrong. So sometimes there's a concern that if you have the conversation, it's not necessarily going to improve upon the situation, but it could actually make it worse. And people don't want to challenge the older driver or challenge their independence, especially, when it's someone that you have a lot of respect for. And then some people are just stressed. We're the sandwich generation. We're trying to take care of our kids and raising our kids, and also trying to take care of aging parents and making sure that we're trying to balance everything, and it's really difficult. So often it's the priority is whatever's in your face at that moment. So it's easy to be overloaded, and then there are some instances where you don't want to have the conversation, because having the conversation is acknowledging that something's wrong. Denial is a big deal. And it's really hard to see a loved one having issues. And so having a conversation acknowledges those issues sometimes. So what are some of the warning signs? I'm sure many of you are familiar with these. And more frequent close calls. So if you go to visit your parents and you notice that there are a lot more dents in the car, or there's a bush that looks like it's been run over, or a mailbox. So like, be aware and look for those things. If you have a spouse that you're concerned about, when they go out and they come back and you notice things on the car, just kind of note that, and that's one of the warning signs. Increased conflict on the road. If you're driving with someone, or even the person's driving, if there's a lot more frustration and anger, I will admit sometimes I'm oblivious to this. People will honk at me and I'm just like in my own world. So if you notice a lot more conflict on the road, that's one of the warning signs as well. Oblivious to the frustration of other drivers. You don't really understand why they're honking at you, but they are honking at you and they're very upset for some reason. Reluctance from friends or relatives to have the senior drive them somewhere. That's how it was with my mom the last few years. And she's like, I'm driving. I'm like, I'll drive. I feel much more comfortable driving, because, it gets to the point where people don't necessarily want to ride because, they want to make sure, I wanted to make sure that we got there safe or increase our chances of getting there safe. And then people get lost more often. This is a really important one, because as people, if they start having some cognitive issues, sometimes people will say, look, they're just driving to the store, or they're just driving to the place that they've always driven to. But if people start having diminished capacity or increased cognitive issues, there's a risk of even them getting lost in places that they're very comfortable usually going to. An example of this, and this is an old story, but it's really a tragic one. This is a couple who, it's 2011. They were leaving their children's house and they were going home through a route that they knew and had taken for years. And somewhere along the way, they got lost and ended up like in a cornfield. And they ended up dying there and freezing to death simply because they got lost on their way home during a route that they've taken, hundreds of times. So if you notice people, or if you have loved ones who are starting to have some diminished capacity, or you think, oh, they're not going very far, keep in mind that getting lost along the way, could end up tragically. So that is one thing to keep in mind. So, we talked also about, the how important it is for seniors, but some other reasons that they may be reluctant to give up is that, they may think they're going to be a burden to others. I know, my parents, the last thing they want to do is be a burden to me, and they'll do anything to not be a burden to me. So they feel the need to continue driving because they don't want to, they don't want to put any undue burden on anyone else. You have some people too who, may have recently lost a spouse or a friend. Maybe they're losing more friends, and the people who they grew up with and the people they've always relied on as their social system are no longer around. So giving up driving is maybe just one more loss for them. And then there's a real fear of a loss of independence and a loss of social opportunities. You may have someone who, goes to play bridge twice a week, and, they feel like they might not be able to do that any longer. So there are a multitude of issues of why people would be hesitant to give up driving. I'm going to pause. Any questions, Daphne? Or
No questions at the moment.
perfect. All right, so what can older drivers do to continue driving safely? And so these are things that we can really promote and encourage our loved ones to try to ensure safety as long as we possibly can. So driving only on familiar roads, driving shorter distances, we talked about getting lost potentially. Driving on less traveled roads. Are there routes that would be safer? One of the biggest issues for older drivers is left-hand turns and intersections. So can you create a route that lessens an intersection, the amount of intersections or left-hand turns? So maybe even looking at some of that, creating shorter routes with less complexity. Driving during the daytime hours only, avoiding rush hour traffic and avoiding bad weather driving. Another thing that I started doing with my parents, and it's the same thing I do with my kids, is that location services. You can turn on people's locations. So for example, with the couple that had gotten lost, that was a long time ago, but we have great technology now where, you could ask your loved ones to share their location with you so you can see where they're at in case something happens, you know exactly where they're at.
I got a question that's asking, is it ethical to take away their keys?
I think that's a conversation and something that you're going to have to figure out personally. Now, for people with cognitive issues, some dementia or Alzheimer's, and I do have a slide related to this for people who have maybe dementia or Alzheimer's and they refuse to stop driving. There are some tactics that you can do. And one of the recommendations would be to take away the keys or to maybe replace the keys with a set of keys that don't actually work for the car, or do something for the car that prevents the car from starting. Because the whole point is to keep people safe. It's to keep your loved ones safe, and it's to keep other people safe. And if people have a diminished capacity and they're not able to really make their own decisions all of the time, you have to decide what makes sense for you and your loved one. And so there are different tactics and on how to, again, keep people safe. Okay. So even with the recommendations that we made on the previous slide, that was a good segue. That doesn't mean your loved one's not necessarily going to be involved in an automobile accident, but they can help reduce the likelihood of it. As we mentioned in one of the first slides, you know, it might not be, they may have an accident and it might not be their fault at all. But if they're in an accident, their likelihood of getting injured or even potentially dying is much higher. So it's just one thing that we always want to keep in mind. So one of the first slides, just to reiterate, you know, having that conversation, if not handled properly, with the proper amount of empathy, can really trigger depression and deterioration. So it's something to keep in mind. So when and how should the conversations start? I mean, you don't want to start having the conversations after something bad has happened. So, you know, we talked about what are some of the warning signs, you know, take those into account. Are you starting to see some dents and scrapes on the car? Are other drivers yelling at them? You know, are you hesitant to get in the car with them? When you start seeing those diminished skills, you should probably start having a conversation, because that conversation may not mean or be about you need to stop driving. It may be about what's the plan? You know, what's your plan? Here are some things that I'm noticing. So when you have the conversation, it's very important to be very specific. So cite specific examples. What happens a lot of times, at least with spouses and with children, you know, we say, look, it's not safe for you to drive anymore. Look, you're doing this, you know, I don't want to get in the car with you. So there's a lot of emotion. And as I mentioned earlier, with my mother, who's independent and opinionated, that's just not going to work. But if you go to them, instead of saying, you know, you're a horrible driver, you shouldn't be driving anymore, you can cite specific examples. Look, when we were driving today and at that intersection, you went out in the middle, and I was really concerned because you turned left in front of cars that were coming at us. And I felt like we were on the cusp of an accident. So be very specific, try to remove the emotion, give examples, and the goal is not to immediately put them on the defense, because ideally, in a best case scenario, you want them to make this decision on their own. We want to empower people. We want people to be able to maintain their dignity regarding a situation or something that is typically so important to people throughout their entire lifetime. So another thing, as we're talking about people who have a diminished capacity or some cognitive issues, and many of you may be familiar with this, there's the clock drawing test. And this was a study that was done, again, it was done a long time ago. It was done in 2002. But what they did, they took 119 people who, you know, lived at home. They all drove. They all had a valid driver's license, and they were all 60 or older. And what they found was that the clock drawing test was very accurate in predicting how good of a driver that particular person was. And so if you're not familiar with the clock drawing test, what it is that you ask someone to draw a clock and how that clock would look. And in this example, it says, draw a clock that says 20 minutes past 8, 20 minutes past 8. And you can see here, this is how they drew their clock. So if their clock is pretty incorrect, what they found was that this strongly correlated to how good of a driver that they were. Another example. So it's used in predicting functional impairment in older adults with varying cognitive statuses. And so this is a very simple thing that can be done to determine, and like I said, it was so strongly correlated that it might be a good example to determine whether or not a person should maybe pause or think about changing whether or not a person drives. So if a senior refuses to stop driving, this gets back to the question that was asked earlier. I highlight the first few here. If they refuse, there are some different things that can be done that can improve people's driving skills. AAA has a road-wise driver course that can be taken. AARP has a smart driver course. Like I said, I'm in California. The California DMV has a mature driver improvement courses. Some of these courses, if you take that actually will help with some insurance costs. Some insurance companies will give you a discount if you've taken some of those. The other bullet points are specifically related to people who may have dementia, Alzheimer's, cognitive issues. So sometimes they may forget that they can't drive. Put the keys in a safe place where maybe they couldn't find them. That's one of the things someone asked earlier, whether or not it's even ethical. And again, you need to decide that, because if the goal is to keep somebody safe, that's the goal. Replace the keys with the set that doesn't work. Park the car in a place where it cannot be seen. The person may eventually forget that there is a car there. I've heard some people say, you know what, the car's broken, the car doesn't work anymore. And so some people accept that. You can disable the car or install a kill wire that prevents the car. You can write a letter to the DMV or have someone write a letter to the DMV. And then the DMV would reach out about renewing a license or reevaluating that particular license. Call the police, or you could sell the car. One thing I neglected to mention at the very beginning of this discussion, our Beyond Driving with Dignity program. It was created by a highway patrolman in Ohio. And he got tired of issuing so many death notices related to seniors. And so he decided to create a program to help people determine on their own whether or not they should still be driving. So this information comes from that program that he developed, and that's based on his particular experience. So these are all just tips and tricks to help potentially prevent a senior from getting in a car if they shouldn't get in the car.
Monica,
Yeah.
another question.
Mhm.
What to do if siblings disagree?
That's a tough one, because so often in families, siblings disagree. I talk with families every day with the goal of getting everybody on the same page. There are, so I'm going to talk a minute about the program that we provide. Our program is called the Beyond Driving with Dignity program. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a self-assessment workshop. So children typically will hire me to come in and meet with the senior driver, because I'm objective. I'm a third party. I don't have, a dog in the race here, horse in the race. I can, I have an interview for a couple of hours. I can check range of motion. I can look at the medications. I look at their history, any accidents. I look if they've had any falls, because all of these things contribute. Do they have any vision problems, hearing problems? And so it's about a 2.5 hour assessment. I do the clock test. I do a maze just to see cognitively where they're at. And then at the end of that discussion, I would make a recommendation. Look, based on all of this information, this is how you responded and answered the clock test. This is how you responded to this particular question. These are the meds you're on, and a lot of these meds create drowsiness or dizziness. So I can look at all of that information and at the end create and make a recommendation on whether or not that person should still be driving. And then say, look, it is not my decision. It is not your family's decision necessarily. You make this decision. And as I was mentioning, the gentleman, the highway patrolman who created this, as a result of this program, 63% of the time, people actually give up the keys on their own. And that's the whole idea, is that you allow them to maintain their dignity. So when you ask, how do you get all the siblings on board? You could do something like that. Bring me or one of my colleagues in. Like I said, we're all across the country to do an assessment like that. There are also occupational therapists who do driving assessments literally in the car driving with people, and they can help make recommendations and determinations. So in situations like that, I think bringing in a third party that, again, is not biased and is completely objective, that's probably the best way to get everybody on board with how to best move forward. And then again, you take it or leave it, the information that you're given from the third parties. But that would be the most objective way, I would think, to try to help that situation. Because as I mentioned, 63% of the time, people actually give up the keys because it's very honest, constructive feedback, and it helps them come to their own conclusion. If you think back to what I was saying, to be very specific, look, I was very concerned when we were driving this afternoon and you made that left-hand turn at the intersection in front of oncoming traffic. I was scared. So, based on that, we should probably have a discussion. Another thing I think is really good data to have is that this is the latest, according to AAA's annual Your Driving Cost. In 2024, it cost about $12,300 per year to own and maintain a car. And that's based upon driving 15,000 miles of annual driving. Now, that's probably more than a lot of people drive, but that includes everything: car payments, car insurance. And so when I talk to people, the way I explain that, $13,000 is a lot of money that you could use for Uber or different, ride share options. They also have some different options now that that make it a little bit easier. So when I work with people and, someone's on the fence about, oh, I'll lose independence, you're like, you've got options, and basically you just need to look into what's available in your area. But these are some options that we have in LA, and this isn't comprehensive. There are options beyond this. There's Access Paratransit, GoGo Grandparent. It's a senior-friendly ride coordination with Uber and Lyft. So it's for people who don't have a smartphone, but this helps them get those rides that they need. City Ride, volunteer driver programs. We have Jewish Family Services here in LA, and you don't have to be Jewish to actually use some of the services. So you just can look into what's available in your area, and my colleagues all across the country, have the different resources that are available in their areas as well. And this specifically for, doctor's appointments. Sometimes there are shuttles, many hospitals and clinics. So there are some options. So if you're having this conversation with your loved ones, it's really good to come prepared, because to say, look, you need to stop driving is one thing, but to come and say, based on these examples, you may want to consider not driving. And if you do decide to not drive, here are some options on how you can maintain your independence and get around. And if you're spending, on the low end, $9,000 a year to maintain that car, those resources can just be reallocated to some of these other options and some of these resources to, again, really help maintain your independence. I tell people, giving up the keys, it's not giving up your independence. There are alternatives. They're just different than what you've used in the past. And then, another thing you could do is that, okay, let's say it's decided, someone's like, nope, I'm not ready to give up the keys, not yet. Then it takes you to the next level of the conversation. Okay, when do you think you would be ready to give up the keys? Is there a line in the sand? Is there something where you say, okay, at this point, I'll give up the keys? So if you can create a family driving agreement, this is really beneficial too. If you do have some maybe mild cognitive impairment and there's a thought that it will progress, at what point you can say, we have this family driving agreement. We discussed that at this point you are going to stop driving. So it's just about being proactive and trying to identify, okay, if now's not the time, when will the time be? And it doesn't have to be complicated. This is like super simple. I realize there may come a day when the advantages of my continuing to drive are outweighed by the safety risk I pose not only to myself, but also to other motorists. I think if you can have people understand too that you're not necessarily just worried about them, but you're worried about anybody else who might be on the road, or even people who aren't on the road. I mean, there are stories of obviously, kids who have been hit, pedestrians who have been hit by people who probably shouldn't be driving. So a family driving agreement is a good thing to consider, beforehand. Because, as I just said, a retirement for driving might mean a loss of convenience. It shouldn't mean a loss of independence, because today there are so many alternatives. Now, I know that everybody doesn't live in a big city, but I was in San Francisco last week, and the amount of self-driving Waymos on the street in San Fran and in LA, I mean, the alternatives are only going to become greater and greater. So it's just about having the conversation, and then putting a plan in place as to, what the different steps of maybe the aging process or the disease progress, what that's going to mean. And so that's it. That's all I have to say. I always end my presentations. These are my parents. This is why I got into this industry several years ago, because I was trying to figure out how to best help them and care for them. If you want any other information, or this little QR code is my contact information, so feel free to scan that with your phones and reach out to me directly if I can, and I can provide you some additional resources. But my goal, and I think most people's goal on this call, is, how do we keep the people that we love safe? That's the point of all of this. So that concludes it. Are there any other questions? Oh, there was a question about originally, Daphne, what was the question about was it the DMV or something like that?
Oh, asking about the insurance
Mm.
process with somebody who has dementia. Let me pull it back up.
Okay, give me 1 second.
Yeah.
I've printed out one other little thing here too.
The question was, can you speak to what happens with insurance when someone is diagnosed with dementia?
I actually looked into that right before this call. And like I said, all the insurance companies, you're going to have to work with your particular insurance company. One of the questions that I had posed, like, if someone who has been diagnosed with dementia has an accident, does the insurance company necessarily cover that accident? And I think it's all dependent on the insurance companies. But the response that I had looked up, it said, they may cover that accident. They'll cover that accident, but they may reevaluate the medical condition going forward on how to deal with the coverage in the future. Are you there, Daphne?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's that. And then there's one other thing. I think we have just like a few more minutes I wanted to read just to kind of tie it all up. Back to where we started on the need to be have empathy during these conversations. This is something, and bear with me, it's a really good essay, but it takes just a couple minutes. It's called A Granddaughter's Essay, and it's by Deborah Kobler. And it says, think back to the day that you had to take your first official driving test. You were probably 16 years old, scared but confident that you would pass it. Chances are that a parent or grandparent took you for your test. Now reverse this and imagine you as a middle-aged adult taking your grandfather, who at the age of 92 had to take a re-examination road test with the local sheriff. My grandfather, Nelson, had to do this. Unfortunately, my uncle, his son, anonymously reported him to the Department of Motor Vehicles in a distant state, claiming that he was a hazard on the road. Out of the blue, my grandfather received a letter in the mail that he had to take a road test again. The letter stated that he had been reported as a hazardous driver. I honestly cannot say that he was a hazardous driver. After all, he was a farmer and had been driving since he was 10 years old. His eyesight, mental status, and mobility were excellent for a man his age, and I always did the driving when we were together. His only aging fault was his bad hearing. I never observed him having trouble driving, and in the past 5 years, he only drove locally, a radius of about 20 miles. Unfortunately, with underlying financial motives, my uncle felt that he should no longer be driving. And so instead of taking the time to carefully sit down and broach the subject empathetically and as a family unit, my uncle decided to just report him. When I received the phone call from my grandfather, I knew that something was not right. He then read to me the letter that he had just received. As he was reading the letter, I could hear him getting choked up and even pausing as he was reading it. My heart just ached for my grandfather. I knew immediately that my uncle was behind this, but didn't say anything at first. After trying to calm him down, I said I would call and find out exactly what we had to do. 1 week later, I, the middle-aged granddaughter, rode with my grandfather to the Department of Motor Vehicles to take his driving test. We had to make sure that we had his license, insurance card, vision report, and birth certificate. We pulled up in his little Ford Escort and waited our turn in line. There were 3 cars in front of us, and Grandpa begrudgingly pointed out every person in that line was 16 years old. Grandpa's turn came, and I was told to sit on the bench and wait for them to return. Finally, after 20 very long, heart-pounding minutes, I saw the red car coming. Ah, he's back. As Grandpa approached the stop sign, the trooper had him stop. He motioned for me to come to the car and then told Grandpa to stay put. The trooper walked to the back of the car and spoke with me. These words I will never forget. Sorry, miss, but you will have to drive home. I am confiscating his license for now. The trooper handed me his report and explained to me what Grandpa needed to do next, said good luck, and then kindly excused himself. I proceeded to drive us out of the parking lot, stifling my tears and biting my tongue. Pulling over, I read the report aloud to Grandpa. Grandpa then told me step by step everything he did and, of course, his opinion of the trooper. Then he just broke down and cried. I had never seen my grandpa cry like that, not even at my grandmother's funeral, and I will never forget that heart-wrenching moment. It still haunts me to this day. I know it was partially because he felt humiliated that he flunked his test, but also that his entire lifestyle had just changed. He sobbed uncontrollably and just squeezed my hands. I could feel him shaking so, and I did all I could to hold him tightly and tell him it would be all right. 6 months later, my beloved grandfather died. I'm convinced that this episode is truly what drove him to his grave. In my heart, I know that the whole situation could have been avoided had the approach to his senior driving been handled with more empathy and planning. And just maybe my grandfather would still be here. Deborah Kobler, granddaughter. I thought that was really impactful because it points us back to how we started the conversation. This is a big deal for people, and we need to practice as much empathy as we possibly can when having these conversations. So I hope you guys found the talk valuable. And is there anything else, Daphne? Any other questions?
I don't have any other questions popping up right now, but just wanted to say that I think that story that you just read was incredibly impactful. And I think it does really speak to needing to have these conversations with an air of empathy and understanding that, aging with dignity is very important. Um, but also was looking up the go-go grandparents.
Mhm.
And it looks like if you are maybe not in a large city, you can look up your address and see if the services are available to you, which is nice.
Mhm.
I didn't know if it was nationally or if this was like a California specific
They
program.
do have Uber Senior and Lyft Senior now too,
Yeah.
where the children can actually call Ubers
Mhm.
as well. So that's something else to potentially look into.
Yeah. Sorry, my dog is making some noise.
That's all right.
If there are no other questions at this time, we can go ahead and wrap up. Monica had her information in the slide previous. Maybe you want to go to that.
Yeah.
If there's any questions that maybe you didn't feel comfortable asking here on this platform and want to reach out to Monica directly, her information is here. And just want to give a reminder that we are going to be having our semi-annual Caregiver Spa Day, which is free to caregivers to attend. You can also bring your diagnosed loved one as well. We're going to be having that on Monday from 11 to 2 p.m. at Providence St. Joseph in one of the conference rooms. I can send that information over, or you can check out our newsletter if that is of interest to you. And like I said, completely free. It's going to be some massages, manicures, um, facials, haircuts, things like that. So, but if there's no other questions at this time, I'll go ahead and wrap this up. And this will be posted on YouTube if you happen to join a little bit later in the session and want to go back and rewatch certain clips of it as well. So, great. Any final words?
Thank you, Daphne, for having me.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Monica, for
Bye.
taking care of all this. All right.
Bye-bye.